My name is Rick Atwater. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor. My specialty is addictions, and I've been working with addicts and family members since 1982. What I want to share with you is opiate issues that you hear people talking about today. That they call it an epidemic. I started to see more heroin-related cases, mostly family members coming in asking what they can do for their kid. And we started a group called the Heroin Awareness Foundation. Our mission was to educate and increase awareness about the heroin problem at that time. And this was really the beginning of the community becoming aware of the heroin problem. Overdose deaths continue to rise. They continue to this day. We did what we could then, but we want to do more, which is why we want to tell the story that we're going to present to you today. This story that you're about to see is just one story, but it is representative of the 130 people who die in this country every day from opioid addiction overdose. Some of you probably have been affected by addiction. Many of you are likely to have been affected by addiction. Not all of you affected by the heroin epidemic, but by addiction to other things. So watching this documentary might be troublesome for you, might cause you to have feelings that are uncomfortable. So we want you to understand that those feelings are normal. And we hope that you will talk to somebody about those things. Others of you have not been affected by addiction. This might help you to see the size of the problem we face.
I think it's human nature for a parent to want the best and to want to believe their child. He was becoming more distant, he was sleeping later, he was just not himself. But when things happen that gradually, you change yourself. I wanted to believe him. I didn't want to believe that Mathew started lying to me. I didn't want to believe that Mathew was deceiving me, because he had been such a good kid. He was the golden child. My sisters had an idea what was going on. My nieces and nephews were hearing things. And they said, well, we tried to tell you. They tried to tell me sometimes in roundabout ways, instead of just coming out and saying, this, somebody told me this, and this. He said to me at Mathew's funeral, he said, Pat, I had so many prescriptions from the doctors that I was just giving them out to my friends. We were just playing around with them, getting high. I love Martin Luther King. I always felt that I was born at the wrong time, that I should have been alive during the marches and everything else. And then he was born on Martin Luther King's birthday. You know, it was like every dream come true. I was 32 when I had him. My nieces and nephews lived right next door to me. So when Mathew came along, all of a sudden, Mathew took all their thunder away, and they got a little bit jealous of him, so they started calling him my golden child. His father died when he was 6 months old. His father was killed in a motorcycle accident. I made sure that while Mathew was growing up, that he had good male figures in his life, that he was brought up in the church. He played football, he played baseball from the time he was 5 years old. Mathew wasn't brought up in a black community. Mathew was brought up in a very mixed community, but most of his friends weren't black. From a little boy, he loved motorcycles and quads and ATVs and anything with a motor. I think he must have been about 6 or 7. He got his first motorcycle. I figured he was gonna ride. It was in my family. We had riders in my family. His father rode motorcycle, my father did. So I knew he was gonna ride. If I told him no, he was gonna ride somebody else's motorcycle. So I got him the motorcycle, but I also got him the helmet and the chest protector and everything that could keep him safe while he was riding. He was such the mechanic and so interested in motors that even at that age that his first motorcycle ended up in a bucket. He was about 7 years old. He and my nephew took the motorcycle apart to I guess to figure out how it worked, and then they couldn't figure out how to put it back together. He just had a knack for it. He always wanted to make the motorcycles run better and run faster. And so when he was about 12, I got him an ATV, a quad. He took off with that. He would ride and ride. He would go up into the mountains. Because I live on the side of a mountain, and it's beautiful. In the wintertime, it's gorgeous. In the summertime with the trees. So he would go riding. A lot of times he would go riding by himself because he felt he could think better. He was at peace. He became social and developed a social life probably somewhere around 10th grade. He started having more friends that he went out and always went to, like the haunted houses on Halloween. So I volunteered to be the mother to take them. I could always hear what was going on in the back seat. So I got the in on some of the things they were doing, and they'd forget I was the one driving. It was a good way of keeping in his life. There was a kid that lived down the road that was also into cars. And he would go down to the track in Englishtown, and he would race. He had a race car, and he would race down there. And he started taking Matthew along with him. And he was, about 4 years older, 5 years older. Because Matthew at the time was about 17. I grew up with this kid's mom. I also knew that he was in some motorcycle accidents. What I didn't realize is that because he had been in so many accidents, he had gotten a lot of pain medication. But he had gotten hooked on these pills. When people started to talk about opiates and talk about Oxycontin and how bad it was, and Percocets and Vicodin and all these other medications, and the doctors started getting a push from the other side not to prescribe them, this doctor just cut this kid off without a plan, without something to wean him off or to keep track of how he was doing. It was just that was it. It was stopped. It was probably around 2017. I was away from home for the day, and I got a phone call from my niece saying, Aunt Pat, you got to come home because there was somebody there wanted to beat Matthew up. I was about 10 minutes away from home, and I left home, and I left there, and I went home, and it was just bombarded with everything all at once. That day that all this came to a head, Matthew said, Mom, it's just pills. We were playing around with pills. He's like, don't worry, I'll stop. I said, all right, Matthew, you have to stop. You can't do this anymore. I went and spoke to somebody, member in the community who was he was addicted also to heroin. And he knew my son. And I asked him, I said, just be honest with me. What's going on with Matthew? I said, did you hear anything? And so he proceeded to tell me what was going on with Matthew. And you know what? I think that's probably the most honest conversation he had in his life, because he told me Matthew was hooked on heroin. I mean, it was like all of a sudden, it was like a light bulb went on, my eyes became open, and I could see my son. I could see the healthy kid that was, and then I could see this kid that was maybe 120 pounds at 5'9", where his clothes were hanging off of him. It took that. It took this guy telling me what was going on with my son for the blinders to come off and me to see him. I told him, Matthew, I love you. You're going to hate me for the things that I'm going to make you do, or that I'm going to tell you can't do, or whatever. I said, but you know what? I said, I love you enough to shoulder your hate. I said, because I would rather have you hate me alive than me love you dead. I said, so I'll shoulder your hate. And I did. And I watched my son detox at home. And I watched him sit in the shower at 3 o'clock in the morning because he hurt so bad. I saw him curl up in a ball because everything inside him hurt. His job gave him 2 weeks off. He was a mechanic, and he loved his job. He was working for Maserati. They knew what was going on. I had spoke to them, and they said, don't worry, let him come back when he feels better. He stuck to it for about 2 weeks. I started seeing the signs that Matthew was using again. And this one night I had told him I needed his money to pay his car insurance, and we were outside of my house and I was in the car and he was standing next to the car, and I accused him of using, and he got in my face and he yelled at me. I said, no, I don't want to argue with him because I know he's high and it's fruitless. And I was very upset, and so I left. Well, I got a call like maybe an hour later that Matthew had overdosed, to rush up to the hospital, and I got up there, and that night was horrible, and that was the night, it really hit home that there was nothing I could do for my son. The bottom line was from the doctors, and it was very dismissive, that, well, he's over 18, and unless he wants to, I can't talk to you about it, I can't do anything for you. He took off that day and he went to his job that next morning. It's like, Matthew, you just got out the hospital, you just overdosed, what are you doing? And that was at the point where I told him, I said, Matthew, I said, I am going to have to start mourning you now. I said, because you're like a patient with stage 4 cancer. I said, I know you're going to die. I said, so I'm going to mourn you now. I said, and start the process, because I know I'm going to lose you. I told Matthew, I said, you're going to detox. You have to go to detox. He argued with me and he fought with me and he said, I'm moving out. I said, okay, you can move out. I said, if you don't go to detox, you have to move out. I got him in the car. He got in the car and I took him over to Nyack Hospital for detox. And we spent probably about 4 hours in the hospital. That's when I saw my son. That's when I saw the kid that wanted to get clean. Like those glimpses that you get of your child. And sometimes it might only be 10 minutes, 15 minutes of that amount of time that you get to see who your child was. He was my little boy at that time, laying on a gurney. And then all of a sudden my communication with the hospital and Medicaid and everything just stopped. Matthew was getting released. So I had to bring him home. We went doing the same thing over again. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over again and expecting a different result. This was May of 2018. I went down in Matthew's bedroom. It was like 11 o'clock at night. Matthew was passed out on his bed, on his back, and I just happened to see a needle that was stuck underneath his leg. And I flipped, and I screamed, and he came out of it. I didn't know what to do. I took him to Port Jervis, New York, to the hospital up there. When we got there, Matthew was in the bathroom for a long time, and come to find out he was using in the bathroom of the hospital. Nurse went in and caught him. They brought a social worker in to talk to him, and Matthew said the one thing that got him started in detox. The social worker asked him, Matthew, have you ever thought about hurting yourself? And he said, yeah. She said, have you ever thought about that you want to die? And he said, yeah. And at that point, that's when they had him for 72 hours. It's just long enough to get his mind clear. Just long enough to, just long enough so he could make a decision about his health. If I could find that social worker right now, I'd hug her and kiss her and thank her, because what she gave me was a gift. She gave me 8 months of Matthew's sobriety. When he was coming out after 28 days, he says, Mom, he said, I don't want to take the Vivitrol. I've taken the pills, I don't like what they do to me. I don't want to take the Vivitrol shot. Now, I've already been through him with detox and a couple times, and him doing, cold turkey on his own. So I was like, you know what? Okay, you don't have to take the shot, Matthew, but you can't come home. So I waited for about a half an hour, and he called me back down in the lobby. He says, all right, Mom, I took the shot. I said, okay, then I'll wait for you to come down. He came back home into the same house, into the same area where his best friend lived 3 houses away and hadn't been to rehab and was still using. His girlfriend was still using. His circle of people around him were still using. He said, it's just, I don't want to be in Hillburn. I don't want to be there. I can't be there. And that I understood. In the meantime, a friend of his had died from an overdose. And he went to the funeral. And a few days later, he told me, he said, Mom, he was really upset. He said, people were talking about me. I said, what do you mean they were talking about you? He said, they were talking about how dare I come to this kid's funeral? He said, because they were saying that I was nothing but an addict. And that hurt. And at the time, he was really trying to stay clean. That's where the stigma of addiction comes in, that can fight against somebody who's trying to stay sober. And then his grandmother died. And when I told him, it crushed him. He says, Mom, that was my only chance to know my dad's people, where I came from. We got into the church and we were about 4 pews back from the front. They looked at me and they recognized me. And they knew Mathew, they had seen Mathew when he was a baby, but it had been like 15 years since he saw any of these people. And it was like all the heads turned. All the heads turned and looked at Mathew. He was the prodigal son come back. He said to me on the ride back home, he says, Mom, I am so happy. He says, if I wasn't sober, this never would have happened. Christmas came and Mathew spent Christmas with the family. He hadn't done that in a long time. But everybody said it was like the best Christmas ever. For Christmas morning, he brought me his present to give to me. It was the absolute perfect gift. And the thing was, it was a pocketbook that was the perfect pocketbook that I would ever buy. And so we were still on that high of having a great holiday until New Year's morning, when I got a phone call from a friend of his. He had been at her house New Year's Eve, and they were watching a movie, and she thought he had fallen asleep during the movie, and she was going to wake him up to tell him maybe he should get a ride home. And there, he wasn't breathing. She called me New Year's Day, frantic. They checked him out, and a social worker came in and talked to him by himself. I went back into the room, and he told me, he says, I think I need to talk to somebody. And he started telling me how depressed he had been and how he was feeling. He said he would go back into outpatient. His birthday was January 15th. And all of his friends came to the house for his birthday. I had cake for him. The friends that he had lost touch with had all come back around to support him, to tell him it was okay, that they weren't, he was the one that gave up the friendships. They didn't give him up. He had this great birthday. So that night, it was like 2 o'clock in the morning. His friends had finally left, and I went down into his bedroom, and I asked him if he was okay, and he was. He said, yeah. He said, I had a good night. So I went on to bed, and it was 5 days later. He was eating dinner, he was joking with the kids, and finally he says, oh, Mom, I'm going out with some friends that we were supposed to go out for my birthday, but we're going out now. He kissed me on the cheek, and I said, Matt, I said, I love you. Be good, be careful, I love you. I always said that to him. He says, I love you too, Mom. And he started to go downstairs, and my little nieces, my grandnieces, came running out from their bedrooms. The little one, she was only, I think it was 3 at the time. He comes running out of the bedroom, and he grabs her, and he picks her up, and he hugs her, and he kisses her, and he says goodnight to her. And the older one, who's 5 years older, she came running down the hallway, and she says, well, what about me? And so he grabbed her, and he picked her up and hugged and kissed her and put her down, and he went on downstairs. Eventually the house got quiet. Somebody came into the driveway, and I thought it odd. All of a sudden the kid, I didn't hear Matthew go out the house, but the kid left that was waiting for him. He never came in. Matthew never went out. And I went downstairs into his room and I called his name. And I saw that his bathroom door was on a crack. And I called him and I looked in the crack and I could just see his leg. He was on the toilet. When I opened the door, he was over. I picked him up and over the toilet and laid him out on the floor. And I started CPR. And the whole time I was screaming for my niece to come. And I heard her say, "I hear you, Aunt Pat. I got 911 on the phone." My sister June came and she had Narcan in her car. Since it was cold out, when the vial came into the house, it was warm and it shattered. So we were on the phone with 911. I was like, "Is there any way if we drip it down in his nose?" You know, like anything. It was like anything. Just, the police came. It wasn't that long before they got there. And he started CPR and he gave them Narcan, and Matthew had been gone. Like, I knew, you know, he hadn't moved for an hour. The last text message he sent from his phone was to the girl that he had gotten the drugs with or had brought him to him, or somehow he had texted her. He said, "Be careful, it's all fentanyl." My reverend came that night because I had the chance, thank God, to sit with him after they finished working on him. I planned Matthew's funeral, and I made sure that the kids that he used with, I said, "I want to make sure that you're at the funeral." I said, I want you there. I said, "And when you get there, I want you to come find me and tell me that you're there." There was 3 of them that he was friends with, and Matthew had told me he didn't understand what happened. It's the night, the New Year's, when I took him to the hospital to have him checked out after he had overdosed. He had told me in the hospital, he says, "I don't know what happened to us." He said, "I can't figure out what happened to us. How did we get to this point?" So we had the funeral. It was a long service. It had somebody said there was about 400 to 500 people at this service. And at the end of the service, I had them put 3 chairs up in front of the church, in front of the altar. And I spoke about parents needing to listen to our kids. I spoke about stigma in our community with kids that are addicted to this. And I talked about judging other parents, not knowing what they were going through. I spoke about a lot of things, but I called these 3 kids up front. And I asked them to each take a seat. And I told them that I wasn't angry at them, and I just wanted them to survive. Then I asked the church to pray with me on those kids, and everybody had their heads bowed towards those 3 kids in the front of the church. But you could feel the love flow through that church for these 3 kids. After Matthew's funeral, my sisters asked me if I wanted to go for coffee with them. We got to the coffee shop, and when we walked in there, I looked around and there was about 40 people from my community that were there at the same time, and I sort of didn't understand what was going on. And they said they were there to try to figure out what to do about the epidemic in our community. And that was the birth of Matt's movement by my community, by about 40 people sitting in a coffee shop. We're community education, family support, and recovery. We want to get as much information out to the community as possible. One of those things is Narcan training. Narcan is more than just learning how to give a shot. Narcan training also tells you about the effects of an overdose, what an overdose looks like. I have a different feeling than some people about medication when it comes to your sobriety. anything that's going to keep you alive, especially after you've been through seeing somebody suffering so much and how hard it is. You start to realize how hard it is to get off of heroin. And it's not so much the heroin anymore, it's the fentanyl. You know, in a lot of ways, the pandemic has been horrible for some people, but then it has also brought people together. Gave us a chance to sit back, take a breath, and start working again, you know.
If you're a family member or a friend or a classmate of someone who has an addictions problem or who has passed away from an opioid overdose, there are resources available to you. Go to a Narcotics Anonymous meeting, a Families Anonymous meeting, or an Al-Anon meeting. Those are great places to learn about the disease and to help yourself. Don't wait for other people to start their recovery. Start your own. Don't be ashamed of the person in your family who has an addiction or what's happened to them as a result of their addiction. Talk about it out loud. Use the word. Say addiction. Say heroin. Talk to your neighbors. Talk to your friends. Or get other resources to help you get unstuck.